Last week we thought about Jesus the Lion, the one who is described by the dynamic John the Baptist as the one whose sandals I am not worthy to untie. We also thought about him humbling himself. And now we see him preparing to eat a Passover meal with his disciples. And this is what John writes. Having loved his own who were in the world, he now showed them the full extent of his love. The evening meal was being served, and the devil had already prompted Judas Iscariot, son of Simon, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had put all things under his power, and that he had come from God, and he was returning to God. So he got up from the meal, took off his outer clothing, and wrapped a towel round his waist. After that he poured water into a basin, and began to wash his disciples' feet, drying them with the towel that was wrapped round him. We can barely imagine how shocking this was. The one they called Teacher and Lord, performing the lowest slave's act, the very thing John said he was unworthy to do for him. Most of the disciples seem to have been shocked into silence. Peter, as usual, was shocked into speech and objected strongly. But Jesus said, "Unless I wash you, you have no part with me. You need to let me serve you. You need to let me wash you clean." To know Jesus as Lion, the one coming to us with life-changing power, we have to accept him as Lamb, the one coming as humble servant, and more. But why Lamb? When Jesus washed his disciples' feet, he was showing the full extent of his love. The full extent of his love was to come from the highest place to the lowest, set aside all his rights and all his dignity, and give himself. He made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to death, even death on a cross. As Isaiah put it, he was led like a lamb to the slaughter. To understand this, we need to go back further, long before Isaiah, to God's other great act of salvation. His people had gone as one extended family. Jacob, whom God had renamed Israel, his 12 sons and their families. They'd gone to Egypt to escape famine. They had been honored and given land to live in. But 400 years later, they had grown into a nation with 12 tribes, but no land of their own. As outsiders, they were feared by the Egyptians, who enslaved them and tried to stop their population growth by killing the baby boys. There are many parallels here to the early life of Jesus. We see God's people Israel embodied by one man, Jesus. To cut a long story short, God's salvation stories do tend to be long, as he is working patiently with recalcitrant human beings. God looked on the Israelites and was concerned about them. He called the exiled Israelite Egyptian Moses to go to the Pharaoh and demand his people's freedom. And when Pharaoh refused, God sent a sequence of plagues to persuade them. When none of these worked, the final plague was death to all the firstborn sons of Egypt. The Israelites were instructed to kill a lamb, one per household, and smear its blood on their doorposts. And God said, "When I see the blood, I will pass over you." The meat of the lamb became part of the meal they ate to prepare for the journey when the Egyptians finally let them go, known as the Passover, because the angel of death had passed over them. This was their release from Egypt, from slavery, and the beginning of their journey to their own promised land. That was the great act of salvation, remembered by the Jews, and for Christians, a powerful picture of the greater act of salvation brought about by Jesus, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sins of the world. God knew, and his people soon discovered, that rescue from Egyptian slavery was just the beginning and didn't solve their deepest problems. The big problem was not getting across the Red Sea to make their final escape when the Egyptians changed their minds, not getting across the desert to their own land, not getting across the River Jordan to enter that land, not finding their own home in a land that was already occupied by hostile people. Their problem was themselves. Their problem was the bias against God which is in every human being, which brings with it a tendency to harm each other, to harm the world we live in, and ourselves. It's called sin. Sin is an impenetrable barrier which we have erected and have no power to break down, that comes between us and God. Ultimately, death is complete separation from God, the source of all life and all good, and so the wages of sin is death. To enable Israel to live and be his people, God provided a system of sacrifices, substituting human lives with lambs and other animals. These served as reminders that they were sinful, and it was only by God's mercy that they could come to him at all. Only by God's mercy that they could live. They also showed that just making sacrifices is never enough, whether it's the sacrifice of a lamb, or forcing yourself to give something up, or to do something you don't really want to but know you should. It will never take away your bias to sin and against God. And these sacrifices pointed forward to the one that would work, the sacrifice of Jesus, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. So why does this one work? Because this was a man giving himself, a man with no sin, willing to give himself for others, for sinners. And because this was God giving himself, taking on himself the consequences of our sin, taking the death that was ours, to take away our old faulty life and give us the new life of his Spirit, breaking down the barrier between him and us. All we need to do is realize our need, admit our rebellion against God's way, the failure of our ways, and our helplessness to change, accept the new life, and live in it to be living sacrifices. Jesus, the Lamb of God, went to a terrible and shameful death on a cross for the love of you and me, dying so that we might live. But Jesus, the Lion of God, rose to a new and indestructible life on the third day, living so that we might live. It takes a lifetime and more to find all the answers. But if you want to know more, read the Gospels. Mark is very direct and easy to read. And for a fuller treatment of the resurrection of Jesus, then I would suggest read Luke chapter 24 and John chapter 20. And then, for another angle, for a literary treatment, you can't do better than C.S. Lewis, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, and then read the rest of the Narnia books. Children's fiction, but full of truth about Jesus. And if you've stuck with me so far, well done. Next time, we'll think more about what it means for us that Jesus is the Lion and the Lamb, what the new life looks like.